The air in the Redemption Gulch courthouse was thick enough to chew, a foul stew of sweat, cheap whiskey, and dust. It was late July, 1878, and the heat pressed down on the Nevada territory like a physical weight. On a hard bench at the front, a young Chinese woman sat perfectly still. Her name was Lynn, and the worn, grey silk of her traditional dress was the only clean thing in a room full of grime and judgment. She was 24, though the harsh journey from the coast had etched a decade more onto the set of her jaw. She was the last piece of property to be disposed of from the bankrupt estate of a failed merchant, a man who had dealt in everything from mining equipment to human indenture. The merchant had died of a fever, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a handful of assets. The creditors had picked the warehouse clean. The town had auctioned off his horse and wagon. Now, only she remained, listed on the ledger simply as asset, Chinese, female. Judge Morrison, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He surveyed the room, his gaze slick with amusement. He had a captive audience of miners, ranchers, and drifters, all seeking refuge from the afternoon sun. "Well, gentlemen," the judge boomed, a grin splitting his florid face. "It seems we have an item of no monetary value. The creditors won't take her. The good ladies of the church auxiliary have declined to sponsor her. She carries no papers of value." He paused for effect, letting the cruelty land. "It appears she is, for all intents and purposes, free to a good, or even a not-so-good, home." A wave of coarse laughter rippled through the courtroom. Men nudged each other, their eyes crawling over Lynn with a mix of contempt and crude assessment. She did not flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards, her hands folded in her lap, her posture a silent, unmovable rebellion. The judge pointed a thick finger at a tall, quiet man leaning against the back wall. The man's hat was pulled low, his face shadowed, but he had the lean, weathered look of a man who spent more time with cattle than with people. He hadn't laughed with the others. "You, Stone," the judge called out. "You look like a man in need of domestic assistance. Your homestead out on the alkali flat could use a woman's touch, I hear. I'm feeling generous today. Pick a wife for free." The laughter crescendoed, ugly and sharp. "What'll it be? You want the asset." The man, Jedediah Stone, pushed himself off the wall. He was not a large man, but he moved with a deliberate economy that made him seem substantial. He lifted his head, and the light from the high, dusty windows caught the clear, steady blue of his eyes. He looked past the judge, past the sneering faces in the crowd, and his gaze settled on the still figure on the bench. He saw the frayed edge of her collar, the rigid line of her back, the way her knuckles were white where she clasped her hands. He saw a person, cornered. A long silence stretched, the laughter dying in men's throats as they waited for his response. They expected a joke, a dismissal, a crude remark to match the judge's. Jed's face remained unreadable. He took a slow breath. "All right," he said, his voice low and even, but carrying across the room with absolute clarity. The word hung in the hot, stagnant air. The judge blinked, his smile faltering. "All right, what, Stone?" Jed's eyes did not leave Lynn. "I'll take the Chinese one." The silence that followed was a physical blow. It was heavier than the heat, deeper than the dust. The judge's jaw went slack. The smirks vanished from the faces of the men in the gallery, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. It was one thing to make a cruel joke. It was another thing entirely to call it. Jed had taken the judge's ugly sport and turned it into a public, binding declaration. Judge Morrison sputtered, his face turning a shade darker. "Now, see here, Stone," it was a figure of speech. "A jest." "You're a judge of the territorial court," Jed said, his voice still quiet, but now edged with steel. "You made an offer in your official capacity, in this courtroom. I accepted. There are 30 witnesses." He gestured vaguely with his chin at the stunned crowd. "Seems to me that's a verbal contract. Binding in this territory." He was right. Frontier law, often a tangled mess of precedent and pragmatism, held verbal agreements made before witnesses as seriously as any written document. The judge, a man who prided himself on his authority, was trapped by his own arrogance. He had made a public spectacle, and now Jed was demanding he honor it. To back down would be to admit his words meant nothing, to lose face before the very men he lorded his power over. A cold fury settled in the judge's eyes. "Fine," he spat, the word cracking like a whip. He banged his gavel on the desk, a sharp, angry sound. "The asset is transferred to the custody of Jedediah Stone. This court is adjourned." He stormed from the room without a backward glance. The crowd began to murmur, a low, hostile buzz. Jed walked forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He stopped in front of the bench where Lynn sat. She finally lifted her head, and her dark, intelligent eyes met his. There was no gratitude in them. There was no fear. There was only a profound, guarded watchfulness. He said, his voice softer now. He touched the brim of his hat. "Let's go." He turned and walked toward the door, not waiting to see if she would follow. He trusted that she would understand this was her only way out of that room. After a moment's hesitation, Lynn rose to her feet, her movements fluid and graceful despite the coarseness of her dress. She walked behind him, her head held high, through the sea of hostile stares and muttered insults. The heavy courthouse doors swung shut behind them, but the trouble had only just begun. The sun that greeted them was blinding, the main street of Redemption Gulch a gauntlet of judgment. The walk to Jed's wagon was the longest 100 yards of his life. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to stare. Jed felt their judgment like a physical force, a hot wind at his back. He kept his eyes forward, his focus on the dusty buckboard wagon hitched outside the general store. Lynn walked a few paces behind him, a silent shadow. Her stillness was more unnerving to the townspeople than any outburst would have been. As Jed reached to untie the reins of his horse, a man stepped out from the shade of the store's awning. It was Silas Croft, the owner of the regional freight company. Croft was a man built of solid, prosperous flesh, dressed in a tailored suit that defied the oppressive heat. He was the most powerful man in the county, and his influence ran deeper than the driest well. He held a cold cigar in his hand, his smile thin and unpleasant. "Stone," Croft said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A surprising turn of events in the courthouse today. I didn't take you for a man with a taste for the exotic." Jed finished with the reins and turned to face him. "What I have a taste for is my own business, Croft." Croft's eyes slid past Jed to Lynn, who had stopped by the rear wheel of the wagon. He looked her up and down as if she were livestock. "That asset belonged to a man who owed me a significant sum. $200, to be exact. I was prepared to take her as collateral against his debt." The judge said she had no monetary value, Jed countered, his voice flat. "He gave her to me. You were there. You heard it." "The judge is a fool who enjoys the sound of his own voice," Croft said dismissively. "But a debt is a debt. That woman is tied to it. I have the papers to prove it." He took a step closer. "You're a poor man, Stone. That homestead of yours is barely clinging to life. You don't want the kind of trouble I can bring. Give her to me. I'll even forgive the debt. Consider it a gift." Jed looked from Croft's smug face to Lynn. She stood unmoving, her expression a mask, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep, cold anger. He thought of her on that bench, alone against a roomful of laughing hyenas. Something in him, a stubborn, buried decency, refused to yield. "She's not a sack of flour, Croft," Jed said. "She's not yours to collect." Before Croft could reply, two of his freight hands, burly men with mean, empty faces, moved to flank him. One of them reached out to grab Lynn's arm. "Come on, girlie," the man sneered. "The boss is talking to you." What happened next was so fast Jed almost missed it. Lynn moved with a speed that was startling. She didn't pull away. She stepped into the man's reach, her hand flashing out. She didn't slap him. She used the stiff, folded edge of her hand to strike the pressure point on the inside of his wrist. The man grunted in surprise and pain, his hand going numb, his arm dropping uselessly to his side. Then, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and sharp, and her English was perfect, carrying the crisp accent of a formal education. "Do not put your hands on me," she said. The street went dead silent. The second freight hand froze, his mouth agape. Silas Croft's smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of cold, calculating surprise. Jed stared, reassessing everything he thought he knew about the silent woman in the grey dress. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. Croft recovered quickly. He held up a hand to his men. "Enough," he commanded. He looked at Jed, his eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Stone." A very costly 1 inch. He then turned his gaze back to Lynn, a new, more dangerous curiosity in his expression. "This changes things." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his men trailing behind him like curs. Jed helped Lynn onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her and clicked the reins. The horse, eager to leave the heat of town, started forward. They rode out of Redemption Gulch in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. The confrontation hadn't solved anything. It had only raised the stakes. Jed had publicly defied the most powerful man in the territory. And he had done it for a woman he didn't know, a woman who was clearly more than she appeared. He did not yet know that the small, folded paper she kept tucked in her sleeve was not just a secret, but a claim worth more than Croft's entire freight company. The ride to Jed's homestead was a long, quiet affair. The sun beat down, and the landscape stretched out into a vast expanse of sagebrush and alkali flats. The homestead itself was not much to look at, a small, sturdy cabin made of clapboard and sod, a newly dug well, a corral holding a single spare horse, and a few dozen acres of fenced-off land that looked more grey than green. It was a place of sweat and hope, but it was clear that the hope was losing. Jed pulled the wagon to a halt near the cabin. "This is it," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Lynn surveyed the property, her gaze taking in every detail. She said nothing. She simply slid down from the wagon seat before he could offer a hand. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room held a cot, a small table with 2 chairs, a cold stove, and a few shelves holding tins of beans and sacks of flour. It was the home of a man who owned nothing he didn't absolutely need. Jed brought in a bucket of water from the well. He gestured toward the table. "Please. Sit." She sat, her back as straight as it had been in the courthouse. He poured 2 cups of water and set one in front of her. He took the other chair, the small table feeling like a vast canyon between them. "You speak English well," he said, breaking the silence. "I was taught at a mission school in San Francisco," she answered, her voice even. "My father was a scholar. He believed knowledge was the only property no one could steal." "And what are you doing in Redemption Gulch?" Jed asked gently. "This is no place for a woman like you." Lynn took a slow sip of water. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, weighing him. She had been bought and sold, traded and threatened. Trust was a currency she did not possess. But something in his steady gaze, in the quiet way he had stood for her when he had no reason to, made her take a risk. She reached into the wide sleeve of her dress and pulled out a small, folded piece of oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of paper, creased and worn, covered in neat columns of writing and a hand-drawn map. It was a formal document. "My brother's name was Wei," she said, her voice softening for the first time. "He came here 3 years ago to work on the Central Pacific Railroad. He saved every dollar. He was smart. He learned your laws. Before the railroad moved on, he filed a claim under your Homestead Act of 1862 " She pushed the paper across the table. Jed picked it up. It was an official homestead claim, filed with the Territorial Land Office in Carson City. It described 160 acres of land not on the Alkali Flats, but 10 miles north, along the Carson River. It was prime land, with water rights. The map was detailed, showing the location of a freshwater spring. The claim was dated 1875 and signed by a clerk. The name on the deed was Wei Chan. This land, this is valuable, Jed breathed. He wrote to me, Lynn continued. He told me he had built a small shelter and was beginning to cultivate the land. He wanted me to come, to build a life here with him, away from the city. I saved for a year to make the journey. When I arrived in the territory, I could not find him. The men at the railroad camp said he had vanished. A man in town, a freight owner, told me my brother had incurred a large debt for supplies and had run off, signing over his property to cover it. Silas Croft, Jed said, the pieces clicking into place. Lynn nodded. He showed me papers, a bill of sale for the land. But I knew my brother. He would never abandon his claim. And he would never sign his name with an X. My brother could write in 2 languages. She paused. Croft's paper was a forgery. He kept me, saying I had to work off my brother's supposed debt. He brought me to Redemption Gulch to sell my contract to the miners. But the merchant he sold me to went bankrupt before the papers were finalized. Jed stared at the claim in his hand, then at Lynn. The whole ugly story was laid bare. Croft hadn't just been trying to collect a debt in town. He had stolen a man's land, likely murdered him for it, and was trying to bury the last living link to his crime. Lynn wasn't an asset, she was a witness. A cold knot formed in Jed's stomach. This was no longer about a moment of defiance in a courtroom. This was about a federal crime. This was about a woman's life, and her brother's legacy. Croft knows you have this, he stated. It wasn't a question. He does not know what it is, Lynn replied. He knows I carry something. He assumes it is money or jewelry. If he knew it was the original claim, I would already be dead. Like my brother. The weight of it all settled on Jed's shoulders. He was a simple homesteader, trying to scratch a living from unforgiving soil. He had no power, no influence. He had only his name and a piece of land that was barely worth fighting for. Now, he was caught in a fight with the most dangerous man in the county over a piece of paper that could get them both killed. As if summoned by the thought, the sound of approaching horses broke the afternoon stillness. Jed looked out the single window. A buggy was pulling up, Silas Croft at the reins. He was alone this time, which was somehow more menacing. Jed stood up, his hand resting on the back of his chair. "Stay here," he told Lynn. He walked to the door and stepped outside, letting the screen door swing shut behind him. Croft remained in his buggy, looking down at Jed with an air of supreme confidence. "Stone," he began, his voice deceptively pleasant. "I've come to understand we had a misunderstanding in town. I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to offer you $500. Cash. For the woman." $500 was more money than Jed had seen in 5 years. It could buy seed, a new plow, 2 good horses. It could save his homestead. "She's not for sale," Jed said, his voice hard. Croft's smile tightened. "Do not be a fool. You cannot protect her. And what is she to you? You think this is some storybook romance? You have saddled yourself with a pariah. The town will not sell you supplies. No one will help you at harvest time. You will be as much of an outcast as she is. I, on the other hand, can make your life very easy. Or I can make it impossible." He let the threat hang in the air. This was the choice. His land, his future, his safety, or the life of a woman he had met only hours ago. He thought of the paper on the table inside, of a man named Wei who had dreamed of a life on this same frontier. He thought of Lynn's quiet dignity in the face of so much hate. "My answer is the same," Jed said. "You should leave my property, Croft." Croft's pleasant mask finally dropped, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. "I see," he said, his voice turning to ice. "I own Judge Morrison. I own the sheriff. There is no law in this valley but the one I write. I will have that claim. And I will have her. The U.S. Marshal only comes through this territory twice a year. His next visit is months away. You won't last that long. You have 3 days to bring her to me. If you don't, I'll have the judge draw up a warrant for your arrest on some charge, and I will burn this pathetic excuse for a farm to the ground with you in it." He snapped the reins, and the buggy turned in a tight, angry circle, kicking up a cloud of dust. As Croft rode away, Jed stood watching, the threat echoing in the vast, empty silence of the prairie. 3 days. He was trapped. But as he turned to go back inside, he looked at the telegraph poles glinting in the distance, the thin wires stretching across the empty landscape toward Carson City. The marshal was months away, but a message could travel 100 miles in a matter of minutes. The next 3 months were a testament to quiet defiance. After Croft's departure, Jed and Lynn did not wait. That very night, Jed rode his best horse the 20 miles to the next town, a small railroad depot with a telegraph office not under Croft's thumb. He sent a detailed message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City, outlining Croft's threats, the fraudulent land deal, and Lynn's evidence. He paid for it with the last of his emergency silver dollars, a gamble on a stranger 100 miles away. Then, they worked. Knowing Croft could return at any moment, they lived on a knife's edge, but they did not hide. They poured their energy into the land. Lynn, it turned out, knew as much about agriculture as her scholar father had known about books. She showed Jed how to properly irrigate his parched fields using a series of small, efficient channels from the well. She had a knowledge of crop rotation that was alien to him, learned from farmers in her home province. They worked from sunup to sundown, a silent, effective team. He did the heavy lifting, plowing and hauling, while she managed the delicate work of planting and tending the new growth. They spoke little, but a language of shared labor and mutual respect grew between them. He learned to read her moods by the set of her shoulders, she learned his by the way he handled his tools. In the evenings, they would sit at the small table, and she would tell him stories of her brother, painting a portrait of a man full of hope and determination. Jed, in turn, found himself speaking of his own failed dreams, of the family farm he had lost back east, and the solitary hope that had driven him west. In the shared vulnerability of those quiet nights, a fragile trust began to form. 1 week after Jed sent the telegraph, the local sheriff, a man with Croft's money lining his pockets, rode out to the homestead with a flimsy warrant for Jed's arrest. But Jed and Lynn saw him coming from a mile away. They were not there. Following a plan they had devised, they had taken supplies and hidden in a series of small caves in the rocky hills a few miles away, watching their own land from a distance. The sheriff left, frustrated, but the message was clear: they were now fugitives on their own property. The final resolution came not with a bang, but with the quiet arrival of 2 riders. It was a hot morning in late October. Jed and Lynn were harvesting the surprisingly robust crop of vegetables they had managed to coax from the soil. One of the riders was a tall man with a silver star on his vest. The other was a clerk from the Federal Land Office. U.S. Marshal Vance was a man who wasted no words. He had Lynn's brother's claim in his hand, and he had spent a month in Carson City investigating Croft's business dealings. The forged bill of sale had been easily exposed. Armed with federal authority that superseded any local corruption, Marshal Vance rode into Redemption Gulch and arrested Silas Croft for land fraud, mail fraud, and suspicion of murder. Judge Morrison was removed from his position pending a federal investigation. The marshal's last stop was at Jed's homestead. He handed an official, newly stamped deed to Lynn. The 160 acres on the Carson River were legally hers. "Mr. Croft's assets are being seized by the federal government to pay his debts," the marshal said. "That includes his freight company. The town's going to have a hard winter." He looked from Jed to Lynn, then at the small, thriving patch of green they had cultivated in the desert. "Looks like you two might be the most prosperous folks in the county come spring." 6 months after that, the homestead was transformed. With the money from their first successful harvest and the sale of Lynn's riverfront property to a new family of settlers, they had bought the adjoining 100 acres. They had a new barn, 2 milk cows, and a field of winter wheat that was green and strong. The clapboard cabin now had a proper porch, and a second room had been added. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the land. Jed and Lynn stood on the new porch, looking out at what they had built. The air was cool and clean. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but filled with a comfortable peace. Lynn was no longer in a tattered grey dress. She wore a simple but well-made dress of blue cotton, practical for a farm wife. But she still held herself with that same unshakable dignity. Jed turned to her. The shyness that had marked their early days was gone, replaced by a deep and steady affection. He remembered the judge's mocking voice in that hot, dusty courtroom. "Pick a wife for free," he'd said. It felt like a lifetime ago. "The judge called you an asset," Jed said quietly, looking at her. "Of no monetary value." Lynn met his gaze, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. "He was wrong," she said. "I know," Jed replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, calloused from work, fit perfectly with his. He was wrong about everything. They stood there together as the last light faded, two outcasts who had found a home not just in the land, but in each other. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the simple, profound act of seeing the humanity in another person and standing with them, no matter the cost. Their life was not an ending to a story, but the quiet, sturdy beginning of a new one, built on the solid ground of respect and earned love. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.